right, let's dive into Numbers 21, 4-9.
Okay.
Now, I know you're probably thinking, been there, preached that, got the t-shirt,
Mm-hmm.
but today we're going deep,
Okay.
like really
I
deep.
like it.
We're going beyond those Sunday school basics to uncover some really thought-provoking interpretations and sermon illustrations from pastors who've tackled this passage in some seriously creative ways.
You know, it never ceases to amaze me how this familiar story, the Israelites, the desert, those snakes, that bronze serpent, how it can be approached from so many different angles.
It really speaks to the richness and depth of Scripture.
Absolutely.
And Bethesda Community Church, they took a really interesting approach.
Okay.
They focused on the serpent as a representation of the consequences of sin.
Oh, interesting.
And not just like punishment from God,
Hmm.
but the natural outcome of the Israelites' own words and actions.
So like they created their own mess, so to speak.
Exactly. It's like they brewed their own poison.
I see, yeah.
What's so powerful about that interpretation is that it shifts the focus. It moves away from this purely theological framework of sin and punishment,
I see.
and it brings it down to like a human level.
Yeah.
You see the Israelites, and by extension, ourselves,
Right.
as responsible for the toxic environments we create through our negativity and bad choices.
That's a good point. It really does make you stop and think, doesn't it? About the power of our words, our actions.
For sure, for sure.
Are we part of the problem or are we part of the solution?
And now for a completely different take. Reading in Covenant Church, they used a medical analogy
Okay.
that I thought was super interesting.
Right.
They described sin as a snake bite
Okay.
and looking at Christ as receiving the antivenom.
Wow, that's good.
Isn't that good?
Yeah, that's really good.
It's brilliant because it connects with the modern audience.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
We may not relate to ancient medical practices, but we've all seen those nature documentaries where someone gets bitten by a venomous snake
Oh, yeah.
and needs that antidote. You know,
Yeah.
it creates this sense of urgency, immediacy that's hard to ignore.
It does.
And it drives home the point that we need Christ's saving grace just as urgently as that snakebite victim needs the antivenom.
It's so true.
Speaking of looking to Christ,
Yes.
several churches, FBC Benbrook, Life Community Church, just to name a few,
Okay.
they use Numbers 21, 4-9 as a springboard to talk about being born again.
Ah, interesting.
And they emphasized how that act of looking at the bronze serpent foreshadowed the spiritual act of looking to Christ for salvation.
It's interesting how they draw that parallel between a physical action and a spiritual reality.
Right.
It's not just about seeing with our eyes, is it?
No.
It's about shifting our focus, our attention, our reliance towards Christ.
It really makes you wonder what the modern day equivalents of looking to Christ are, you know? Like, what does that even look like in a world that's just constantly bombarding us with distractions and all these competing ideologies?
That's a great question.
It is a great question.
What do you think? What do you think it looks like?
I think it's about intentionally choosing to focus on Christ's teachings amidst all the noise.
Right.
You know, it's about seeking his presence in our lives,
Yeah.
aligning our actions with his values, even when it's difficult.
Yeah, I like that.
Okay, so we've got sin as poison. We've got Christ as the antidote.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got this idea of looking as a spiritual act of turning toward him.
Yeah.
Now, Grace CMA Church introduced this concept of spiritual erosion.
Okay.
They were arguing that sin, like the Israelites complaining,
Yeah.
it wears away at our faith and trusting God's timing.
That's interesting.
And I think a lot of pastors out there, they can relate to this.
They probably can.
You know, we see in our congregations all the time,
I bet.
people who start out strong in their faith,
Mm-hmm.
but then doubt and frustration kind of creep in, especially when they're facing difficult circumstances.
Makes sense.
It's like those Israelites, they'd seen incredible miracles,
Right.
yet they still allowed negativity and impatience to erode their trust in God. And here's what's fascinating. Grace CMA Church connected this to a secular concept,
Oh, wow.
Freud's pleasure principle,
Interesting.
right? They argued that just like those Israelites demanding instant solutions in the desert,
Yeah.
we as humans were wired to seek instant gratification and avoid pain.
Mm-hmm.
And that can sometimes really sabotage our spiritual growth.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. Freud popping up in a sermon on Numbers 21, 4-9.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Wild.
But it's so insightful.
It is.
It helps us to understand those really deep-seated human tendencies that can lead us away from God and towards that instant gratification,
Right.
even when it's not in our best interest.
So true.
Okay, so we've covered some deep theological and psychological territory here.
We have.
But what I love about these sermons are the creative and often unexpected illustrations that these pastors use to bring the message home.
Yeah, me too.
Because it's one thing to grasp a concept intellectually, but it's another thing to actually feel it, to see it played out in a way that just resonates on like a deeper level. Absolutely, yeah.
So, for example, Bethesda Community Church. Remember, they talked about sin as poison.
Yes.
They used a reference that I bet resonated with pretty much everyone in their congregation.
Okay.
Indiana Jones and his fear of snakes.
Oh, nice.
Even a hero like Indy, he's got his vulnerability.
He does, he does.
And it makes the fear of consequences really relatable.
It does.
Now, for a totally different approach, FBC Benbrook, they focused on the being born again theme, remember?
Right.
They use this incredibly simple but effective visual.
Okay.
A diner
Okay.
with a sign that says, under new management.
I love that.
Isn't that great?
That's so good.
It's so easy to picture, and it just perfectly captures that idea of transformation.
Yeah.
When we accept Christ, we're essentially under new management with a new purpose and a new direction.
Absolutely.
But what really got to me was the pastor from Radiant Covenant Church.
Okay.
He shared a personal story about his own struggles after he moved to Memphis. He talked about facing these unexpected challenges, how it tested his faith,
Oh, wow.
but ultimately brought him closer to God.
That's power. I mean, that's the power of vulnerability, right?
Exactly.
When pastors are willing to share their own struggles,
Yes.
it creates a sense of authenticity and connection
Yes.
that can be so impactful.
So impactful.
Yeah,
Because it reminds us we're not alone in our doubts and fears.
absolutely.
And it makes the message so much more relatable.
It does.
It's not just some abstract theological concept.
Right.
It's something that real people grapple with every single day.
That's so true.
So we've explored some fascinating interpretations and illustrations of numbers 21, 4-9 today.
We have.
What's exciting is that this is really just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah,
There are so many other ways to approach this passage.
I agree.
So many other insights to uncover.
For sure. You know, one thing that struck me as we were going through these sermons was how they all kind of highlighted the simplicity of the Israelites' solution. Right.
Just look at the bronze serpent and be healed.
Oh.
It seems almost too easy, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. But maybe that's the point, right?
Maybe.
All these pastors we're looking at,
Yeah.
they seem to be drawing a parallel to the simplicity of salvation through Christ.
Right.
We don't have to jump through hoops, earn it, you know?
Yeah.
We just turn to him in faith.
It's a message of accessibility.
Yes,
Grace is available to everyone,
exactly.
no matter their background or their past mistakes.
You know, it really challenges us
Yeah,
to examine our own approach to faith.
it does.
Are we overcomplicating things?
Good question.
Are we getting bogged down in rules and rituals instead of focusing on that core relationship with Christ?
That's a good point.
It's a great question to bring back to our congregations.
Yes, it is.
Because it's so easy to get caught up in the how-tos of faith, you know?
Right.
But this passage reminds us that it's really about looking to Christ.
It is.
And speaking of challenges, one theme that kept coming up.
Was this idea of sin having consequences,
Right.
like lasting consequences.
Yeah.
Bethesda Community Church, they really drove this point home,
Okay.
talking about how the poison from our actions, it can linger long after that initial bite.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, we often just focus on those immediate consequences of our choices.
Right.
But those ripple effects, they can be far more significant and long-lasting
Way more than we realize.
than we even realize.
It's like throwing a stone into a pond, right?
Oh, yeah.
That initial splash, it's just the beginning.
Uh-huh.
Those waves, they just keep spreading outward,
They do.
impacting not just ourselves, but also those around us.
So true. Our words, actions, even our thoughts,
Wow, yeah.
they can have unintended consequences that we might not even be aware of.
It really makes you think about those times when we're grappling with the consequences of someone else's sin.
Right.
How do we offer grace and support while also acknowledging that lasting impact?
That's a tough one.
It is. It's a tough one.
I don't think there's any easy answer.
Yeah.
But I think this passage reminds us that healing is possible,
Yes.
both individually and collectively, through Christ.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another major theme
Okay.
that we saw in these sermons.
Mm-hmm.
The importance of trusting God's timing.
Oh, yeah.
The Israelites, they got impatient waiting for deliverance,
They did.
led them to complain, doubt.
Right.
We see this pattern throughout Scripture,
We do. We do.
even in our own lives.
all the time.
It's timeless, right?
It
We
is.
want things to happen on our schedule.
Right.
But God often works on a different timeline.
He does. And that waiting,
Yeah,
it can be so frustrating,
it can be.
especially when we're in the midst of suffering or uncertainty.
But it can also be a period of just immense spiritual growth.
It's like that saying, faith is not believing that God can.
Right.
It's knowing that he will.
It is.
And that knowing,
Mm-hmm.
it often comes through the waiting, doesn't it?
It does. Those seasons where we're forced to rely on God's strength
Yeah.
rather than our own understanding.
It's a tough message to preach sometimes,
It is.
but it's one we all need to hear.
Yes, we do, especially in a culture obsessed with instant gratification.
Especially in our culture.
Now, trusting God's timing,
Yeah.
it doesn't mean just sitting on our hands.
Right.
Several pastors emphasize that.
Mm-hmm.
It's about actively seeking His guidance,
Yes.
discerning His will,
Right.
and taking steps of faith even when we don't know what the outcome is going to be.
Even when it's uncertain.
Right.
You know, going through these sermons
Yeah.
has really challenged me to look at this passage
Ah.
in totally new ways.
Me too.
I'm seeing things I've never noticed before.
Yeah, me too.
Nuances, connections.
That's the beauty of engaging with these different interpretations.
Uh-huh.
It expands our understanding.
It does.
It enriches our own perspectives.
Yes.
It opens up new avenues for teaching and preaching.
And speaking of new avenues,
Let's talk about those illustrations again.
I love the illustration.
I love them. They were the highlight for me.
Me too.
Creative, thought-provoking,
Mm-hmm.
and most importantly, relatable.
Yeah.
Each pastor just brought their own personality and experience to their illustrations. They
It
did.
made them so engaging.
No.
Like Bethesda Community Church using Indiana Jones
I love that.
to show that even heroes are vulnerable.
I know. So good.
Such a great way to connect with a modern audience.
I know. It was brilliant.
And remind us that we're all human, you know?
Yes.
We make mistakes.
We do.
We need grace.
Yeah, an FBC Ben book, that under new management sign.
Yes.
So simple, but so effective.
So good.
You know, I'll admit, I was a little skeptical at first
Oh, yeah.
when I saw that Grace CMA Church brought Freud into their sermon.
Okay.
But the way they connected the pleasure principle to the Israelites' impatience
Yes.
was actually really insightful.
It was.
It shows how these really deep-seated human tendencies
Right.
can sabotage our spiritual growth,
Mm-hmm.
even when we have good intentions.
Yeah, even when we're trying.
Even when we're trying.
Yeah.
It's a great example of how we can draw inspiration from unexpected sources,
Uh-huh.
even secular ones,
Absolutely.
to illuminate these biblical truths.
And of course, we can't forget the pastor from Radiant Covenant Church
Okay, no,
who shared that personal story
I know.
about moving to Memphis,
Yeah.
facing those challenges.
Hmm.
It was raw.
It was vulnerable.
It really drove home the point that pastors struggle too, you know,
Yes,
with doubt, with uncertainty.
everyone does.
It's a powerful reminder that we're all in this together
Yes.
and that God is with us
He is.
every step of the way.
Every step of the way. It's interesting, you know, as we've been talking about these different sermons,
Mm-hmm.
it's really hit me how they all point to the transformative power of this passage.
Yeah.
It's not just some historical account or a list of rules.
Right.
It's an invitation to a deeper relationship with Christ.
It is. It's about allowing those truths to really shape us,
Exactly.
change us.
It's not enough to just know about the story of Numbers 21, 4-9.
Right. It's got to be more than head knowledge.
It's about letting it work in us,
Yeah.
refine our character, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. Letting it guide our actions.
and that transformation,
Uh-huh.
that journey of becoming more like Christ, it's a lifelong process, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah.
It's a continuous cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Growth, refinement, surrender.
And it's not always easy.
It's not. There are going to be setbacks,
Oh, for sure.
doubts,
Yeah.
moments where we feel like we're taking one step forward and two steps back.
All the time.
But that's where grace comes in.
That's where grace comes in.
The pastors we've been listening to, they all emphasize this.
Yeah.
It's not about being perfect.
That's not about perfection.
It's about continually turning back to Christ,
Absolutely.
seeking forgiveness,
Mhm.
relying on His strength to carry us through.
And that brings us back to that image of looking to Christ.
Right, right.
We talked about how it's not just physical, it's spiritual.
It's a choice we make.
Uh-huh.
to shift our focus,
Our
our
attention,
reliance on Him.
our reliance. Yeah, but how do we actually do that today?
Right. How do we apply this ancient story to a modern context? How do we look to Christ in a world that just never stops demanding our attention?
Right. Good
I
question.
mean, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. I think it starts with being intentional,
Okay.
choosing to make that relationship a priority
Even amidst all the distractions,
amidst the noise, the chaos.
seeking His guidance in those decisions,
Hmm.
big or small.
Absolutely.
Letting His teachings shape our values, our relationships, how we interact with the world.
I like that. Yeah.
It's recognizing that looking to Christ isn't just a one-time thing.
It's not a one and done.
It's an ongoing practice, a daily discipline
Uh-huh.
of seeking His presence,
Yes.
listening for His voice.
Aligning our hearts with His will.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Numbers 21:4-9,
Yeah.
I hope you're walking away with more than just some sermon ideas or discussion topics.
Me too.
I hope you're leaving with a renewed sense of just how powerful this passage is and a challenge to look to Christ
Yes.
in fresh, meaningful ways.
I agree. And remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation.
It is.
There is so much more to uncover, to explore in the story.
That's the beauty of it.
It is.
So keep digging,
Keep digging.
keep questioning, keep seeking,
Yes.
and you'll be amazed at what you discover.
Absolutely. You will.